Oh god. Okay. Hello, I'm Nat. Wow, it's been so long I forgot how to do my intro. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we are going to be doing my June wrap-up. Before we get into anything bookish, however, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments what was the most disappointing book you had this month. Yeah, it has been a hot second, and if you saw my June TBR, then you know I went in very optimistic that I would read a lot of books while I was on vacation. Did not get all of that read. I definitely did better than I thought I would. I'm also still riding that wave of vacation and drinking a pina colada today, even though I've been back to work for 2 days, so. Before we jump into all of my reviews, however, let's first start out with my stats. I actually read 10 books this month, which is fantastic. In terms of pages read, I read 2,364 using my eyeballs. Don't have a audiobook conversion part here because I didn't have a pages read graph this month, unfortunately. But in terms of audiobooks, I did listen to about 24 hours worth, so that's still pretty awesome. Speaking of awesome, my average rating was 4.05 stars. Amazing. So glad. Obviously, I had a very good reading month. In terms of my personal goals, I had 3 own voices stories. I did complete 1 big book, which was more than 450 pages. Unfortunately, however, I did not have a nonfiction, and I also didn't read a comic. As for my genre breakdown, I read 4 books which fall under fantasy, 1 classic, which is very impressive, 1 horror, and then finally 4 romances. I didn't take the time to order these reviews in a fun way. Honestly, it's kind of impressive that I even took the time to write out reviews at all. So we're just gonna go chronologically from when I finished these books. First up, I read Mythos by Stephen Fry, and I actually read this as a part of my Greek retellings 5x5. That video already came out, so I'll put a link to it in the cards, and I gave this 5 stars. You can find a full review over there. Next up is my 1 horror book I had this month, and this was actually a rollover from May. That was Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth. Whenever I wrote my original review after finishing this, I said, wow, okay, I can't decide on my feelings here. That's really helpful, past Nat. Let me just start out with the summary. This is basically following 2 timelines, both revolving around this school for girls. In the past timeline, we are following the after events where these 2 girls who started a club, the 2 girls were actually a couple and ended up dying, and then we're seeing the repercussions of their death and possibly trying to figure out the mystery of what led to said deaths. While in the current timeline, we are following multiple different women who are involved in the making of a movie about these 2 girls who died in the past. This was so slow. So slow. There's definitely a very creepy atmosphere underlying the entire thing, and there is a bit of a mystery going on. It really didn't feel like we had any development in the mystery until 400 pages into the book, and this is over 600 pages, so that's a lot to work through. Since this is incredibly character-driven, thankfully the character work is very well done. I genuinely do not remember the number of perspectives we see from. Some of them we only see from once, and then others are recurring, but across the board, I will say all of them were very distinct. They all had their own voices, and all of their tones matched with their personalities very well. I do think there were some elements that would get introduced to us that, while they furthered the character background, I don't really think they were all that necessary in the grand scheme of the book. They ended up just taking extra page space. Since there are so many point of views, I did, however, have a hard time keeping some of them straight whenever we would be seeing the 3 women together in the current timeline, because we see from each of their perspectives. So whenever they were together, it would get kind of confusing as to whose eyes we were seeing through. My favorite perspective throughout the entire book, however, was definitely Alex in the past. Alex was the domestic partner of the woman who ran the school where the 2 girls died, and I felt as though her perspective furthered the mystery the most. That also was probably why I enjoyed it, but at the same time, I did really enjoy Alex as a character. I thought I truly understood her. I really got her motivations, and I could understand her viewpoints on the situation, but at the same time, the overall tone throughout her perspective was the most unsettling. And with that, I actually think if the whole current timeline had been completely removed from this book, it still would have been just as enjoyable as a mystery story. Although we got some fantastic character work in the current timeline, and it definitely added to the creepy, unsettling mystery that was taking place, I really don't think any of those perspectives added too much to the plot. The three women in the current timeline are Harper, Aubrey, and Merritt. Harper I didn't really care for, Aubrey was okay, and I didn't actually like Merritt at all. It just felt like all of their perspectives were basically utilized to build suspense, and that could have succeeded if we ended up finding a resolution to the mystery in their perspectives as well, but they have nothing to do with it. But in terms of the reveal with the mystery, I did think it paired well with the rest of the story. I think it made perfect sense. It was still equally as unsettling and followed the trend of the themes that were being brought up with all of these different women. I think it just kind of further cemented my opinion that the current timeline really wasn't all that necessary. So unfortunately, this came out to about a 3.5 star on 𝗖cie. I'm glad I read it because I've been so curious about this book for so long, but unfortunately for me, it just was a bit of a letdown. I do think I'm going to keep it on my shelves, however, because I do really like this cover, and I am just proud of myself for getting through this tome. Next up is a book I both started and finished on my flight to Athens, and that was Summoned to the 13th Grave by Dorinda Jones. This was the official last novel in the Charlie Davidson series, which I have been rereading. Once again, I loved it. Can't believe the main story is over. I have loved this found family so much. I am so glad I reread this and got to re-experience all of the adventures throughout it. I am so excited for the continuation of this universe that we're going to get with Charlie's daughter's story. Once again, this earned 5 stars from me, and after this I ended up jumping into the novellas for the very end of the series. So next I read 13.5, which was The Graveyard Shift, also by Dorinda Jones, obviously. This novella is specifically looking through the eyes of Charlie's best friend Garrett, and he is watching after her daughter Beep, who, I say Beep, Beep is the nickname Charlie gave her when she was pregnant. Her name is actually Elwyn. Garrett is watching after Elwyn, who is now 5 years old. Unfortunately for him, one day she ends up disappearing. This is definitely a big issue because she is an incredibly powerful 5-year-old. And I am very sad to say that this was a disappointment. After all of the buildup we have had in the 13 books, I was so excited to finally jump into these novellas, which were new to me, and get more of these characters. And while I loved seeing through Garrett's eyes, we also see through the perspective of his baby mama, Marika. They try to reconcile their romance throughout this. I just didn't really care about it, honestly. I understood Dorinda Jones was trying to give Garrett his happily ever after. That's not what I was interested in. The entire plot around the two of them just felt incredibly over-dramatized. I really don't think Marika's perspective, which we also saw from, added too much to the story. I didn't have very much attachment to her either because we really don't see that much of her in the original series. While I thought the two of them were cute together in the little scenes we did see, the reveal of their past problems just felt incredibly contrived. And then Marika had this final secret of why they couldn't come together literally erased in like 2 lines. So I don't get why it was even necessary. On top of that, it was just kind of hard to keep the perspective straight. In terms of the main plot revolving around Elwyn's disappearance, I actually really hated what Dorinda Jones ended up doing there. I wanted to see tiny Beep interacting with the rest of this found family, but we don't see all that much. We're told a lot about her that I really enjoyed, but what we actually see of her is so different due to the circumstances that end up coming about. I hated those circumstances, which then made me hate the way Elwyn was characterized. The entirety of this novella was just a giant letdown. In terms of 𝗖cie, this ended up coming out to a 2.5 stars, and I am so sad about it. We're gonna come back to this series in the future though. So after that, I wanted a little bit of change of pace, and I ended up jumping into First Comes Like by 𝗖cie RH. This is the final book in her modern love series, and it is following the perspective of 𝗖cie, who is the youngest of the 3 roommates this series is following. 𝗖cie is a beauty blogger and influencer, and she has actually been messaging with this person for over a year now. She believes this person to be a big name Hindi movie star, and then one day when she finally goes to meet him, turns out she has actually been catfished. Luckily for 𝗖cie, however, Dev is instantly head over heels for her, and the two of them end up basically concocting a fake dating relationship to try and impress 𝗖icie's parents, who are very overbearing and worried that she is wasting her life in a influencer job. First off, I started this with the audiobook, and may I just say, don't read it. It is very bad. Both of the voice actors don't do justice to these characters. After maybe 10 minutes, I ended up putting it down and jumping over to the ebook. I will say this was pretty cute, but I kind of had issues in terms of the romance, feeling like it both moved way too fast and also way too slow. I liked the initial setup of the catfish situation, but as soon as the two meet, it felt incredibly insta-lovey. Then we hop into a fake dating scenario, which eventually develops into a fake engagement. Honestly, I think 𝗖cie was trying to respect the fact that 𝗖ici's character was Muslim and was fairly devout, so of course she probably wouldn't be having premarital sex, but 𝗖cie still wanted to give her readers the spice they've come to expect from this series, so she found a way to make the two characters get married so she could then give you the spice that you expect. I honestly would have preferred if she just didn't give us spice and spent more time really developing the relationship between these two. I just had such a hard time with how little 𝗖cie and Dev really knew each other for them to quite quickly get married. The chemistry just didn't build for me. But in terms of positive, I did think that 𝗖cie was a very realistic character and was true to what had been established in the previous two books. She could be kind of aggravating, but it also made sense for her character. While on the opposite side, Dev, whose eyes we also see through, was initially very intriguing to me, but by the end of the book, I just really didn't feel as though he had that much personality, and I'd kind of lost interest in him. Like I said, the two of them were pretty cute together, and I really enjoyed these small, intimate moments they would share, but overall, I just was not invested enough in them to be happy that they were hopping into a very quick marriage. I really just wish there was less drama revolving around their families getting involved into their relationship and more focus on just the two of them spending time with one another and really getting to know each other and understand their backgrounds. The third act drama, which of course you always expect with romance books, felt so unnecessary and furthered my point of the fact that these two really didn't know each other. As I mentioned, there was spice in this, but I actually think it was pretty tame in comparison to the first two books, maybe 2 chili peppers worth. So ending thoughts are, I kind of like this. So unfortunately, this is another romance series where I really enjoyed the first and then the sequels kind of let me down. So this one ended up coming out to about a 3.25 stars. After that one is the book that took me the longest to read this month. I usually ended up taking it with me to the pool, so it has gotten a little waterlogged in places, but that was Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I also read this as a part of my personal book club I do with a few friends, and then also a part of the Sugar and Spice book club. I believe the live show has already come out, so I'll put a link to that in the cards if you're interested. This is Emily Henry's newest book, and if you are unaware, I have really enjoyed Emily Henry's previous romance stories. This one specifically is following Nora, who is a big name literary agent. She ends up going on vacation with her sister to this small town that inspired a book written by one of Nora's clients. However, while there, she ends up running into an editor who actually shot down said book, and the two of them have basically been professional rivals ever since. Like I said, I've loved Emily Henry's 2 previous books, so I went into this one with fairly high expectations. And thankfully, I'm happy to report it did not disappoint. The character work was impeccable as always. That's something I've just come to expect from Henry's books. Nora felt completely real, and by the end of the story, I felt I knew her so well that I could almost consider her a friend. While I believe her books are marketed as romance, they almost fit more as literary fiction with a strong romance subplot, because she gives you cute, romantic, and steamy moments, but alongside those, they're such wonderful creations of characters who are dealing with real struggles and real issues. Specifically in this one, we were looking at Nora's relationship with her sister and how she felt as though her sister was starting to pull away from her and start keeping secrets. Personally, I don't have a sister, but I could definitely understand where Nora was coming from when it came to her love and care and how protective she was of her little sister Libby. Though I definitely gotta say, I was not a big fan of the fact that they called one another 𝗖cie. This is kind of enemies to friends to lovers, I guess more like rivals to friends to lovers. That first stage is fairly short. However, I love the time she dedicated to Nora and Charlie really getting to know one another. There's tons of entertaining banter and also some very deep personal conversations that feel just as intimate as the spicy makeout scenes we get to see as well. Charlie was definitely a very solid love interest. Even though we weren't seeing from his perspective, I still felt like I really knew him by the end of the book. The though I don't think he's really like a new fictional crush or anything. Also, in terms of romance, this didn't have the traditional third act conflict between these two. You kind of always knew this ending issue was going to come up. I found that incredibly refreshing in a romance story. There was also some fantastic quotes when it came to the love of books and stories. On one hand, I really enjoyed them because sometimes I have such a hard time verbalizing my own thoughts about books, and Emily Henry actually managed to do that for me. But on the opposite side, it did occasionally feel a little self-congratulatory, kind of like how Beach Read was with romance stories. Like I said, both Nora and Charlie felt incredibly real, but I do think that Libby, Nora's little sister, could kind of become a bit of a caricature. She was sort of annoying at points, and for half of this book, I really wanted Nora to go off on her, particularly whenever we had this like final drama at the end with those two. In the end, I really enjoyed this one, but I do think this does get a little bit of disservice as being marketed only as a romance book, because Emily Henry's books handle so much more than just a traditional romance. This one ended up coming out to about a 4.42 stars on Copile. I think I'm gonna round that up to a 4.5 in the end because I did really enjoy this. After that, I finished out a advanced reader copy I received from NetGalley, which was called Bet On It by Jodie Slaughter, and I'm actually not gonna be giving you a review here because I have a ARC reading vlog that's gonna be coming out soon with full thoughts over there. Whenever it's out, I will put a link to it in the cards. Okay, so by this point, I was traveling back from Venice to Texas. So first up was a audiobook I started and finished on the flight, and that was Passing by Nella Larson. This was actually the Booked Since the 90s book club pick for June, and I'm so glad I picked it up. This is a literary classic following two women who are both African American and were friends as children. However, they run into one another as adults, and the main character, Irene, finds out that her friend Claire is actually passing as a white woman now in the 1920s. Usually, classics and I do not get along at all. However, this one was fantastic, and I am definitely going to be checking out more of Nella Larson's work. This book starts fairly quiet. Once you get to the end, it is shocking to realize what this book started out as and what it has evolved into. It covers so many important topics: racism, sexism, loyalty to your race, loyalty to your sex, colorism, trauma, and jealousy. This covered so many important topics, and I was so impressed with how Larson handled each and every one of them. This audiobook was barely 4 hours long. I blasted through it in no time, and yet I felt like so many of these topics which are brought up were handled very well. From the first meeting at the very beginning of the book, I was hooked. I wanted to know more about both of these women, and I think Larson managed to establish all of the integral players to the plot as well-created characters who developed throughout the story. I was definitely most intrigued by Claire, who was living as a white woman. I really wanted to understand her motivations and her thought processes for how her life had turned into what it was. Oh my gosh, Irene, our main character whose mind we're in, I really struggled with my feelings for Claire right alongside Irene, and as Irene begins to spiral towards the end of the book, I could not stop listening. In the end, this packed so much into a very short book. It was incredibly thought-provoking. I've still been continuously looking back on it. My Copile came out to about a 4.5 stars, but I think I might just go ahead and bump it up to 5. So impressed with this. It might actually be my new favorite literary classic. I highly recommend the audiobook for this one. Next, we're jumping back to the Charlie Davidson series with 13.6, and that is The Gravedigger's Son. This one is following Amber and Quentin, who were teenagers in puppy love in the original series. However, now Amber is about 22 and is working as a PI herself, while Quentin is a demon hunter. Thankfully, this one was so much better. This delivered exactly what I was wanting in terms of the relationship between Quentin and Amber, but also gave a fun demon hunting angle. I really enjoyed seeing both of these characters as grown-ups. We alternate between both of their perspectives. On one hand, I do think Amber did kind of read a little like a Charlie light. You could see some of the established personality traits from the previous series of how Amber is so sweet, so kind. She is just so loving. She has such a big heart. While on the opposite side, Quentin definitely still felt very true to the character established. He is quiet, reserved, shy, but he's so kind. He is so protecting. I loved the two of them. This definitely had that feeling of second chance romance, which I suppose it kind of is. However, with that being said, there were some like logistical issues in terms of the plot and certain facts given to us in terms of timeline. Unfortunately, the POV switches also weren't incredibly consistent here, which is a shame because I know Dorinda Jones can handle alternate POVs given how she wrote the Sunshine Bikram series. I don't know why both of these novellas I had issues with it. I also realized I don't think I brought up the fact that Quentin is actually deaf. However, there is a development in between the original series and this novella that slightly changes that. Initially, I was a little upset about it, but then I came to realize how it is handled and how Quentin reacts to his hearing slightly returning almost feels like a metaphor for a deaf person receiving a cochlear implant. I don't know if that's necessarily how Jones wanted to write it, but it definitely seemed like Quentin was dealing with some of those changes and struggles. For example, I loved how Quentin would fixate on certain sounds Amber made that he couldn't hear when they were teenagers, like her giggling or her grumbling. It was just very adorable. But again, it also just felt like a very interesting take to do. I ended up giving this one 4 stars as well. I did really enjoy this a lot more than the first novella. There is a final one that I think is supposed to come out in August now, so once I get that one knocked out, officially finish the Charlie Davidson series. Honestly, I could just go for an entire book about Amber and Quentin kicking ass and taking names and falling in love with one another again. The two of them are adorable. Okay, I've been filming for a hot sec, but we were finally to the last book. So finally was Beach Read by Emily Henry, and this was a reread for me. I previously read this as a part of my first Enemies to Lovers 5x5, and I think I gave it 4.5 stars over there, but honestly, I'm just gonna bump it up to 5 stars. I love the two of these characters so much. First off, I guess I should say, this story is following the perspective of January Andrews, who is a romance author. However, unfortunately for her, she has fallen into a bit of a rut after her father has passed away, and he left her this lake house in Michigan. She ends up going there with the hope that she can kind of lock herself in and finally finish out a book. However, unfortunately, she ends up realizing that her next door neighbor is Augustus, who she considered her literary rival ever since a snide comment he made in college, but he is also incredibly sexy. I love this one so much, and I genuinely think a big part of it is the fact that Gus reminds me a lot of my own boyfriend Josh. There is so much banter in this. This weirdly manages to ride the line between enemies to lovers while also having a second chance romance. As I mentioned with book lovers, Emily Henry's character work is absolutely phenomenal. January feels so incredibly realistic. The issues and the grief process she's going through, while at the same time she is really struggling with the anger she has at her father for the situation she has learned about, and yet the entirety of it is just so satisfying. Upon reread, I actually was going through and tabbing. Unfortunately for me, I had actually ran out of 2 other colors, so I'm gonna have to go back in and mark those. There was a particular line which made me howl laughing on the plane. The two of them are traveling out into the middle of nowhere and they come to a stop. January specifically asks Gus, "Be honest, did you bring me here to murder me?" I said almost that exact same thing to Josh the first time he took me to his house because he lives out in the country. There's also many references to Veronica Mars, which is one of my absolute favorite TV shows, so is it really surprising that I love this book so much? I think my one downside I have with this entire book is just the fact that January seems to cry at the drop of a hat. On one hand, I totally understand that she is in the middle of the grieving process. She is definitely struggling with some serious issues, but I'm a bottler and I hate crying in front of people, so that's just a personal issue. But I gave this 5 stars. It was so freaking good. I'm so glad I reread it. I loved it so much, and it was a great way to end my June reading. Okay, y'all, so that is it for today. Thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. I have all my socials linked in the description if you're interested in keeping up with what I am reading. I come out with videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!